Overholser. I'm the director of the Journalism School, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to a really, what I know is going to be an extremely interesting presentation with Robin Stone, who has edited this extraordinary book that I just had the privilege of finishing called My Times in Black and White, Race and Power at the New York Times. And I want to take just a minute to say how affecting I found this book, having myself worked at the New York Times, having known Gerald Boyd a bit, especially as a fellow the University of Missouri, the Missouri Journalism School was Gerald's alma mater, and really a cherished alma mater. I mean, it changed his life, as he was the first to say, and he became a great leader and supporter of Mizzou. So Robin asked me, is it okay to have Mizzou up here? And I told her, yeah. But I had been so struck as I read this book by the strength of his voice. Robin edited the book. Robin's was Gerald's wife, and when he died, I'm going to ask her this later on, how developed was the book, but his voice is everywhere in it. And for example, one of the quotes that he said that really struck me, having spent years at the Times, and as all of us who've been in these major newsrooms know, there's a moment when you get there and you think, oh my God, what am I doing here? I really, how did I get in here? It's just a joke, they'll discover, and they're made to feel this way in so many ways. And yet one of the things that he was wont to say to people was, don't think for a second that you don't belong here. A wonderful sentiment, and not one that was often heard, I must say, at the Times. Another one that I just loved is, just bring your whole self to the job. I can't imagine a better piece of information, a better piece of counsel for our young journalists here than that one. Bring your whole self to the job. Now, Robin is certainly a journalist who has brought her whole self to a very distinguished career. A career that has taken her in many directions. She wrote a book called No Secrets, No Lies, How Black Families Can Heal from Sexual Abuse. She has been deputy editor at Health magazine. She was founding editor-in-chief of Essence.com and executive and deputy editor of Essence. She's been a journalist for more than 20 years. Before those positions, she was in newspapers at the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Detroit Free Press. And I know that it's Robin you want to hear, but I got to read one really interesting quote in here. I hope I don't embarrass you, Robin, but this is really, this is so the New York Times. Many of you will agree. So Gerald writes, my final break with Lelyveld, you all will know that Lelyveld was executive editor at the Times at one point, came over Robin. She was deputy food editor when Lelyveld decided to remake the feature sections. She and her boss, these really cool dining in, dining out, those of you who are New York Times readers, that, for example, I believe was probably Robin's idea.
I worked on the prototype.
And she, when Lelyveld decided to remake the feature section, she and her boss, Trish Hall, threw themselves into the project. And after Hall left the newspaper, Robin filled in as section editor with her sights set on the job. After about 6 months, Lelyveld decided to name as section editor Rick Flasty, a longtime friend and former Times colleague who had helped redesign Science Times and other sections. Lelyveld brought Flasty, who was white, back with the mandate to oversee the redesign project that Robin had helped develop. Robin decided she would rather not be deputy to a new boss to implement her ideas. At the same time, she received an offer to become a senior editor at Essence, the popular black women's magazine. She knew she had a lot to contribute, and the idea of working for the top magazine in its genre appealed to her greatly. She met with Lelyveld as she considered the offer. This is very Timesian, too. Of course, Lelyveld's going, we don't want to lose her. She's a big talent. Just because I didn't give her the job, I should have given her. So he said that if she wanted to work for a magazine, she could join the Times Sunday magazine, where he would make her a junior editor. He said he had not heard of Essence, and at lunchtime he went out and bought a copy. He then tried to convince her that she was too talented to work for such a publication. The more he talked, the more determined Robin became to leave. He missed the point entirely. Essence spoke to two issues she cared deeply about, blacks and women. There was no need for further conversation. To Lelyveld's amazement, Robin left the Times for Essence. So here you go, Robin.
What a note to start on.
It's a pretty Timesian note.
Yes, thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been experiencing the wonders of the LA Expressway system. Dropped my son Zachary off, Zach's 13, at a friend's in Bellflower, somewhere south, and I just barely got here. And when we were on our way, we left at 9 this morning. When we were on our way, Zach just looked at me and he says, "Mom, the GW Bridge has nothing on this." So if anybody's familiar with New York and the traffic, he's like, "I'm never complaining again about the traffic." So I'm delighted to be here and to have made it. And thank you, Geneva. We've been corresponding for months by email because I knew I wanted to bring Gerald's book to different audiences, to expose, in particular, students. I knew that's something Gerald would have wanted to do, to his life, his take on journalism, on being in this profession, on the New York Times, and also his personal story, which I think is just as fascinating and compelling as his professional story. So I'm going to talk about the Times and sort of the story behind the Times, and I'll do that for 15 or so minutes, and then we'll be happy to take questions. And I want to start by saying one of the reasons I'm doing this, too, is because I start at schools by asking students, first, how many have heard of Jayson Blair? Raise your hand. Not a lot. Not a lot. And then I ask how many have heard of, before you heard of me coming, Gerald Boyd. And usually there are no hands, right? No, none of the students. And I say, you know, this is the story that we should know. This is the major production. Jayson Blair was really a bit player in a life and a legacy in journalism that truly mattered. I'm going to talk about a few things. My Times in black and white has been called a number of things if you read some of the reviews, not all of them good, but I'm of the adage that there's no such thing as bad press for books. And I see, you know, even a negative review will get a blip on Amazon, so I'll take it. And it fuels the discourse about the issues that Gerald raises as well. Some of you may have known Gerald personally. Some of you may have known him through references in the media. He was often described as the gruff managing editor of the New York Times, or the brusque managing editor of the New York Times. And I don't know too many nice managing editors, but that was the label he got. I'm going to talk about the Gerald Boyd who I knew, and I knew him on a number of levels. The first level that I came to know him on was professionally. He recruited me to the New York Times. We met 20 years ago here in Los Angeles, actually, at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention, which was held here in LA, and I was all of 24. It was my first NABJ convention, and I was an editor at the Boston Globe, and I was hanging out here. I wasn't looking for a job. I had just been hired at the Boston Globe, and I wasn't looking for a husband either. And I was at the Century Plaza Hotel in LA in the lobby, and the Times sends recruiters to these conferences of minority journalists, and they go looking for people to talk to connect with, to perhaps follow, track through their careers, to encourage to come to the Times. And they go with a list of people. I don't know if they do that anymore, but they used to. Well, I was on their A list, as Gerald called it. And so he knew who I was, but I didn't know who he was. And he saw my name tag in the lobby, and he came up to me. He was 14 years my senior. And he came up to me and he says, "Are you the Robin Stone?" And I thought, who's this old guy with the goofy grin talking to me about the New York Times? And he proceeded to convince me, and he had me meet with other editors from the Times to encourage me to come to the Times. And sure enough, and I remember he said, "You think you're good right now, Miss Boston Globe, but you come to the Times and you'll know. You'll know that you know that you know that you're good." And so that, among other things, encouraged me, persuaded me. And in no time, I was moving down I-95 from Boston to New York. So I came to know him professionally initially. He was my boss. I worked for him on his Metro staff. I was also engaged, I should say that, to my college sweetheart. And he was married, but separated. So there's a love story in here. You know, I got to understand the way he led as a leader. He didn't just say, here are the answers, here's the way to do it, but he was a very collaborative leader and a collaborative journalist. I remember I was on the late shift on the Metro desk, and if you're ever on a newspaper staff and you're on the editing side, you might find yourself doing this. I closed the late edition. I worked 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., closing the second edition, or sometimes 6 p.m. till 2 a.m., closing the third edition. And sometimes if news demanded it, we'd have to muss up his section. We'd, you know, move some stories, shrink some stories to get art in, what have you, depending on the news. And so I'd do my job and I'd go home. And the next day, I'd come in and he'd stop by my desk or call me into his office and he'd say, can you tell me your thinking about the decisions you made, why you did things a certain way? And sometimes I'd explain, sometimes I'd argue, and sometimes he'd say, okay, I see your point. But other times he'd ask more questions. He'd say, well, what if you had done it this, what if you had paired those two stories out front, or what if you put the image and made a refer inside? And it was through answering the questions that I got to see better solutions, because journalism isn't always right or wrong. It's sometimes better ways to do things. And that's the way he led, with people who worked for him as well as his peers. I want to personalize Gerald Boyd, the gruff managing editor. He was tough, and he was proud. Some people would say he was arrogant. And one of the reasons I call this book a success story is because I think he never forgot where he came from. Gerald was born and reared in St. Louis, Missouri. He came from a poor family. He was orphaned. He lost his mom when he was 3. She died. And his dad just up and left St. Louis for New York when he was a little older. And then the family decided that it was him, his brother, and his sister, that the sister would be better off raised by relatives in California. I just left his sister in Oakland, California, before we came here. So he was losing people at this young age, and he grew up so poor they couldn't afford lunch. They had breakfast and dinner. So this is the route he came through. And when he was in high school, he decided to go into Upward Bound, if anybody's familiar with that program. And it was through Upward Bound that they put out a newspaper. It was really 8.5 by 11 paper, mimeographed and stapled together. But he got a byline, and he got to write, and people responded to his writing. And he decided then that he was going to be a journalist. And it was really when he applied and received a 4-year scholarship to University of Missouri, sponsored by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, that really changed his life because it opened the door to this whole new world. And he decided he was going to be a journalist and good enough to work at the New York Times. And he did that and so much more. So he had this long string of firsts. In addition to being a rabble-rouser on University of Missouri's campus, he was there in the 70s, big afro, dashiki, right on, power to the people. He adopted the name Uganda X, okay? This was Gerald Boyd the Radical, and if anybody who knew him, I mean, you try to like square those two images. So he was a rabble-rouser on campus, but he was also a leader, and that's where one of his firsts, he achieved one of his firsts. He was elected to the Student Council government, the first African-American elected to an executive position on the Student Council government. And once he got into journalism, a string of journalism first. He was the first black City Hall correspondent for the Post-Dispatch. Then they sent him to Washington. He was the first White House correspondent who was African-American. Other papers started looking at him. The New York Times came calling, and he became the first black White House correspondent for the New York Times. He covered Reagan, and he covered Bush, the first Bush. And then the Times management decided they were going to fast track him into management. They thought he had just the right temperament to succeed at the New York Times in management. And I think they were right. on that. And so he was the first black Metro editor. That's how our paths crossed at the New York Times, the first black assistant managing editor, first black deputy, and first black managing editor of the Times. So this long string of firsts. And so when people characterize him as arrogant, I think that's a term that people apply all too often to African Americans and men, black men, who are sure and direct and firm and know what they want. I think he was proud, but arrogant, I wouldn't say that. Some people called him an SOB, and he could be. I think he was really tough on people. He was tough on me, but he was tough on himself too. And you can see in the book, he was tough on himself. He didn't spare himself either. So that was Gerald, but he was also very encouraging and compassionate as an editor. There's a story about a reporter who opened the Bronx Bureau. The Times at one time had a bureau in the Bronx. And this guy started, and he was going gangbusters, cranking out stories for months. And he sent Gerald an email saying, you know, I'm exhausted. I would love to just take a week off and get my bearings. And Gerald's email response was 2 words, take 2. So that's the kind of boss he was. He supported good journalism. He supported people who were passionate about getting the story, getting it first, getting it right, all the basic tenets of journalism. I came to know him as my husband, the love story part. When I left Gerald's department, he got up the nerve to ask me to dinner. And so I went to dinner with my big diamond ring on. And the first thing he said was, "You're not going to marry that man." So there began the courtship. And when we finally started to see each other and became an item, a lot of gossip at the New York Times, he said, "You should move in with me." And I said, "Well, you know, okay, I got rid of the fiance, I'm free, I'm young. You know, when the lease runs out, I'll move in with you." Well, one day he called me at work, because I worked later than him, and he said, "Don't go home, don't go to your place, come home to me." And I went to his place and saw that he had moved me. He hired movers, and they packed up my apartment, and so there was all my stuff. So what could I do? So we were married a couple years after that, and then came Zachary, who's our son, who's 13 and looks just like his dad, and has all his mannerisms too, and swears he will not be a journalist ever. Zachary, I think, righted Gerald's life, as he says in the book. Zachary came late in Gerald's life. Let me say also, I was Gerald's 3rd wife. And after Gerald was looking for a family, again, he lost his family as a young child. And I think that's a part of the personal thread of this story. So he was looking for a family. And so when Zach came along, Zach could do no wrong. I was the bad cop to Gerald's good cop. And our conversations would go something like, "You know, honey, I don't think we need a telescope that can see Pluto and download the information to your computer because he's 3. So let's wait. I don't think he needs a chemistry set. He's 5." And he just adored Zach. And I think one of the blessings in Gerald's having to leave the Times, and I will get to that, in the wake of the Jayson Blair scandal, was that he was home with Zachary for 3 years and was able to spend time that he would have never been able to spend with his son. He was the biggest booster of the Harlem Little League, I think, that they'd ever seen. The kids all got pizza and everything they wanted. And I think he was able to be a part of Zach's life that he wouldn't have been able to be. So I mentioned Jayson Blair, and I can't believe I didn't see more hands go up. But as we know, Jayson Blair was the young reporter who was caught plagiarizing at the Times in 2006. And upon investigation, editors discovered that not only did he steal from other people's stories, but he made stuff up out of whole cloth. And he was reporting in stories saying that he was sending in stories from Texas when he was really in Brooklyn, sitting in his apartment. And upon this discovery and upon investigation, Gerald and his boss, Howell Raines, were asked to leave the Times. Now, I call the situation, the environment at that time, the kindling. Gerald and Hal took over the Times in September 2001, 6 days before 9/11. So they led the staff through 9/11, and the staff was tired and taxed through 9/11, through the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, all these, Enron, all these breaking stories, and they were scrambling, and they never got a chance to put their team in place. People were not happy because they were pushing for change on staff. Hal preached a vision of increased metabolism in the newsroom. I don't know if any of you all have heard that phrase, but he wanted more running and gunning for stories, and they wanted to move people. People were uncomfortable. They were unhappy with the changes that were being made. So I call that the kindling. You had this atmosphere where there was stress and exhaustion and frustration. And then Jayson Blair comes along, and I call that the match. So it really lit this situation up and led to, as I said, Gerald and Hal being asked to leave in the wake of the scandal. But that's not the whole story, because Gerald's story is really the full arc of his life. It doesn't end at the New York Times, though certainly he describes a lot of that situation from his perspective. In the end, he was very much at peace. When he left the Times, like I said, he stayed home. He started working on his memoir, became a booster of the Little League. He also did a column for a while that really tried to explain how the sausage was made, if you will. He wrote about journalism and how journalism decisions get made in newsrooms. And he worked for a while for Can West newspapers, which is a chain much like Gannett in Canada. He was an editorial consultant. So he stayed busy. He was looking for a job. He wanted to get back into newspapers. I think eventually he would have had his chance. One of the things that was in his way was the assumption that Gerald, because he's African American, aided and abetted Jayson Blair in his journalistic sins, if you will, because Jayson Blair was African American. So the two became linked, though Gerald did not hire Jayson, did not supervise him, and certainly did not aid and abet him. So it was terribly unfortunate. I think that assumption has been corrected now. It's taken some time. But once that got out there on the internet and in news reports, it was really hard to take back. And that's one of the insidious sides of journalism today is, once something is erroneous, gets out there, it's really hard to make it right. So in spite of that, I think he lived a full and grand life. He loved grandly, as you could tell. He lived grandly. I think he edited that way. He thought big as an editor. And for those reasons, I call it a success story, even though the protagonist is no longer here and had a very difficult time in the end. Overall, given where he started and where he went, nothing but success. So with that, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
I'm just bringing this up because I can't state the whole thing.
Yes.
I've read the book. I like it very, very much.
Thank you.
I thought it was really interesting. I have a question, though.
Yes.
I was a Timesman 25 years ago. Why is that place, I think for black, white, under any administration that comes in, such a fundamentally miserable place to work? I really know almost nobody who's ever worked at the New York Times. I mean, they're kind of proud that they were there, but they look back on it as just this nightmare of intrigue and I've been at other newspapers. It's not like that. Do you have any ideas about why this is?
Well,
because almost everybody I know gets screwed by it.
You know what? I think if Gerald were here today, he would say that was the best part of his life. He really would. other than Zach and me.
But it ended sadly.
It ended sadly, but I don't think he would have done it any other way. I don't think he would have had it. He loved the Times. Not everybody, I didn't love the Times. It was, you could tell with all the positions I had, Gerald used to say I can't keep a job. Because I would find new opportunities and new ways to do journalism and would pursue those. But for him, I think it was his family. He was personally invested in the Times. But, it's the competition, it's the idea that the Times is at the top,
Right.
and so there's no room for error. A lot of people
And
say,
no place to go.
and a lot of people, once you leave the Times, right, where do you go? And when Gerald was looking for a job at one of the publishers at a paper, a smaller paper, in the end took the offer. It wasn't a real offer, but he said, I don't think you'll be happy here because you came from the New York Times. So it's almost, you get to the pinnacle and you find the pinnacle is somewhat dysfunctional, but it's the pinnacle. And, as Gerald refers to the golden handcuffs, people stay, they get the fabulous money, well, for journalism, fabulous money, I don't know about for New York. And, they're often, or sometimes in positions they're not happy about, they don't want them, but they're there, and it's the Times, and it's hard to leave.
Yeah.
It's hard to leave.
That was sort of my take.
Yeah. But, as Gerald said, you think you're good, but you'll know that you know. I mean, I worked with some of the most consummate professionals there. It's a dysfunctional environment, though. Any other questions?
The New York Times has never had a top editor, a woman or a person of color, and that's true of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Do you think the owners of these papers have a bias that they're not even willing to recognize in their promotions?
That's a very good question, and something I would pose to the owners. I think if you follow Gerald's story, there are some very telling incidents. The fact that he did not have a personal conversation with Arthur Sulzberger Jr., who was the publisher of the Times, in his own home until after he left the Times. I think that's telling that they didn't know each other personally, yet Gerald was at this position. I think for a lot of people who are not white males, you're an outsider even if you're seen as an insider. And I think that was very much Gerald's situation. Even though he was there, he had been at the Times for 20 years and had just, worked and risen up the ranks, and everybody knew him. He was still, in many ways, an outsider. And that's, I don't know so much if it's bias or if it's comfort or what have you, but I think that's very telling. Yes?
I have a question about the dysfunction that might reflect my own bias. Gerald, in a sense, was, I think you would agree that he was a victim in the Jayson Blair stuff.
I would never consider him a victim.
But he paid a price for that. And maybe my perception is off, but it seems that the Times took that incident with a certain level of seriousness and aggressiveness in investigation, right? When we were obviously dealing with the pathology of a young man.
Mm-hmm.
And I compare that to the crisis a year or so later with Judith Miller, which this is my bias, which I thought reflected a much deeper institutional problem with the Times, that the Times did not seem to take as seriously as, the craziness of this kid, Jayson Blair. I'm just curious, you're very close to this, so I'm just curious on your view of that, and is this all in my head, or is there something to it?
I don't know that it's all in your head. I think what hasn't come out yet is an examination of how the Times and how the media covered how the Times handled the Jayson Blair scandal vis-a-vis Judith Miller. And there was most recently another incident of plagiarism with a reporter on the business staff, I believe. And in each instance, they were handled in very different ways. Now, why? I can't explain that, but I think it certainly bears exploration.
What exactly happened? Was Kelly the editor, or hadn't Joe stepped down, Molly stepped down as editor?
Howell Raines was the other.
During the Jayson Blair incident, yeah, Howell was the editor and Gerald was the managing editor.
What happened? Does he describe the conversation?
Yes. I invite you to read the book. But he does describe what happened. He describes his role in trying to understand the situation and trying to respond to it. And he and Howell did not agree, so he describes the conflicts there. When Gerald was portrayed as being in lockstep with Howell Raines, and that certainly wasn't the case. So he describes his role.
It strikes me that one of the most important parts of this is that prior to Charlene Hunter Gold and
When I told them.
Before that, you couldn't find an African American on the New York Times staff. So here comes along Gerald Boyd and the other people. There must have been some tremendously emotional things going on when he finally left the paper.
Yeah, it was wrenching for him personally, for me personally, but also for people on the staff. I have former colleagues who called crying. I write. People still today recall him and ask how would Gerald approach a certain story a certain way. So his legacy is still present, very much so. Yeah.
One thing that Robin isn't saying that I would just add, I mean, it certainly comes through in the book, and having known Howell Raines, and as others of you did, I would say that's one of the most interesting things, because Howell, I mean, it's very interesting how the book handles this. Howell Raines is an extremely complex man who was himself an extremely controversial executive editor, and of course, Gerald was not Howell. I mean, somehow it just kept being sort of, they kept being thrown together, and as if there were no two different views, and obviously the two had very different views, and even the publisher at one point sort of, there's a general sense of, well, you needed to save Howell from himself, as if somehow Gerald could have been the one who would have kept Howell's excesses from bringing them down. So it's really kind of a cruel, I mean, it's remarkable to read that. And he doesn't do it in a way that is, hangs him out to dry. He just sort of builds.
He tells the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, he tells the story. And I mean, he was managing up a challenging boss, and he was managing down as well. So.
Other questions? Can you tell me, I would love to know how if you don't mind, how developed was the book? When Gerald died of lung cancer, he found out in February and died in November of 2006.
Yep, 2006. Yeah. And he had done a couple of drafts of this book. The first draft was over 800 pages. And I remember telling him, nobody cares about the people from the old neighborhood. Pookie now, that's what I said. Nobody cares about Pookie now. So take that out. And so he went back at it, and he had a second version that was about 250 pages. And it started with his walking into the Post-Dispatch. And when I read that, I said, wait, we've got to know, we need to know about your mother and, that backstory. So, yeah, so it was truncated. And so I married the two, but it's very much his words and his voice. And I did some reporting to fill in some of the blanks, especially in his earlier years. He didn't really know his mother. And so she wasn't really drawn very distinctly. And so I interviewed his mother's sister, Aunt Laura, who died 2 weeks ago. And so I got Aunt Laura to describe her sister. What was her voice like? She liked to sing. How did she keep house? Because Gerald, he didn't know those things. So I sort of filled in some of those blanks. Interviewed his first boss, Sidney Cooper, who ran the corner grocery store in St. Louis, to get a better picture of what the store looked like and what kind of worker was Gerald, that kind of thing. Interviewed Gerald's first wife, Sheila Rule, who's a lovely woman and a friend.
A fine journalist.
A fine journalist, and also had spent many years at the time. And I wanted to find out some more about their wedding, to describe that a little better, but also what did Anna look like? And Anna was the woman who Gerald cheated on Sheila with. So, you know, I got up my nerve and said, Sheila, I know this is kind of awkward. But right, and Sheila put on her journalist hat and she described Anna in a not negative way. So, you know, and so I feel that, and as he became more contemporary, I didn't feel the need to fill in those gaps. So, right.
Well, it's a beautifully edited book. I mean, you know, the chapter endings are just remarkable. There's one, for example, where Gerald is visiting Bill Keller in South Africa, where Keller is a correspondent, and Gerald thinks, you know, what an interesting life Keller has, but Gerald, he was really a terrific mentor to many people, and so Gerald thinks, you know, Keller, he has some managerial potential. So he says, you know, to him, we hate to waste any managerial potential. Are you kind of interested at all? And he says, you know, really, Keller just put me off and acted as if he had no interest at all. And then the chapter ends, little did I know. Keller eventually became executive editor. And there's another one when Gerald is in the Washington Bureau, and really, he was such a distinguished White House correspondent. He's in the Washington Bureau where Bill Kovich is running the Bureau, really terrific guy, whom obviously Gerald thought a lot of, and Bill did with him, I know, and Bill's a good friend, and many of you know him. So the changes are occurring. Max Frankel becomes executive editor, and he's going to be changing a lot of the players. I mean, it goes back to Tim's intrigue, you know, all of this, who's up, who's down. So Kovich leaves, and of course then Gerald is cast yet again into this sort of, I'm here alone, that's the last thing I want. And somebody, I'm forgetting who it was, said to him, you know, watch out. In the end, the New York Times will always bring you down, or something.
David Binder.
Yeah,
Sooner or later, the Times will break your heart.
Will break your heart,
Yeah.
which is such a foreshadowing.
Should I share a reading? Is anybody interested?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to share, just given, I started reading from this part, you know, the last maybe month or so, just given the racial tenor of the debate over healthcare reform. And I liken that to the whole Tea Party brouhaha. trying to find a non-judgmental word. You know, I liken that to a lot of white people being very angry that a black guy is telling them what they're going to do. So I want to share this. This is when Gerald leaves Washington. He was a Washington White House correspondent, and he goes to New York, and he's on this management track. So he's going into the New York newsroom for the first time. He had come to the Times in Washington, and so he's moving to New York and starting his role as a manager. For the first time in my career, I came face to face with blatant racial tension in the workplace. When I arrived at the Times newsroom on West 43rd Street, the environment reflected sharp divisions. Emotions were raw over the Tawana Brawley case, in which a 15-year-old suburban black girl alleged she was abducted by 6 white men, raped, and smeared with feces. And when a group of black and Latino youths were tried and convicted in the rape of the Central Park jogger, a white woman, the local media's depiction of the young men as animals deepened the fault lines. These issues hung over the newsroom like polluted air. I was no stranger to racial differences. I had faced that reality all my life and still found a way to succeed. I did not think the newsroom would be so difficult. Clearly, I was naive. The hostility I encountered initially, which I can best describe as passive aggression, surprised me. No one challenged my authority outright, but I had to repeat my orders frequently and then double back to make sure they were followed. Most of my colleagues were politically liberal and believed in racial equality, yet many had never been in a position of having to take orders from a black person, especially one whom they did not know. In fact, few blacks were at the table when the editors discussed important issues. Scanning the newsroom, I saw no black editors on the foreign, culture, week in review, science, sports, or business staffs. Both National and Metro had black editors, but not in leadership positions. There were no natural avenues to discuss issues, so most racial dialogue took place through angry memos or heated conversations that a few blacks risked having. Some of those who spoke out frequently were often seen as militant, not exactly a career-enhancing label. In this highly charged atmosphere, I saw that I needed to tread carefully. I could be both a change agent and a lightning rod for racist views and assumptions. It's a bit of Gerald's voice.
Any of you students have some questions or thoughts?
Come on now. Yes.
I wasn't able to read it, and I wanted to see what was it about.
Chasing Gerald's steps. Zachary and I went to St. Louis, Gerald's hometown, and University of Missouri. So it's sort of, and I started the piece by writing about how as we were driving west on I-70, I thought about how Gerald must have taken that trip dozens and dozens of times. And we were quite warmly received at the university, where we established an endowment fund, the Gerald M. Politics and Press Responsibility Fund. Politics was really his passion. Yeah.
Given what you've just read,
Yes.
what did Sulzberger finally say to Gerald when they finally had their meeting after you? Tease.
No, they talked about just sort of where they both were at that moment. I think that was just a reconciliation. For Gerald, it was, he was trying to move on, and I think that was a part of the process for him.
Never any indication that Sulzberger would have stepped in, stopped what happened?
No, not based on what Gerald knew. Yes.
Did it ever get to him, like, having to double back and, like, knowing that he was obviously not enlightening, but, like, helping other people realize, like, race relations in the workplace? Like, did that ever get at him, that people didn't?
I don't know that it got at him, or you mean frustrated him?
Kind of, like, did it ever just be, like, were there ever days where he's just like, I don't know if I can really do what I'm doing anymore?
We never had that conversation. I think he was someone who promoted diversity of thought beyond, let's bring more black people on, or Asian or Hispanic, but let's bring people from diverse backgrounds. And coming from his background, where he grew up poor, he knew that perspective deserved a place at the table. And when he helped develop the series Children of the Shadows with Selma Golden Bear, 10-part series that looked at impoverished youth across the country. I knew where that was coming from, part of his own personal experience. And then when he worked on, co-led the series How Race is Lived in America, he was fascinated by the racial divide, if you will, and how he called it the silence between the races, and how that can lead to frustration or anger, misunderstandings, and he was interested in wanting to explore those kinds of issues. So I don't think that he never got tired of that. There were some other things, but certainly not that.
If I could just add, I thought it was very interesting. As Robin mentioned, the book has gotten a wide range of reviews, and some of them say, well, he was such an angry man, Well, most of us reading the book think, how come he was more angry in some ways? But he often would deal with something and kind of struggle with how to see it, I think. I mean, you see these things, like I mentioned when the Washington Bureau leadership changed, he was in part of a two-man team covering the White House. By most accounts, I think all of us who were sort of observing at the time thought he would become the top White House reporter, and in fact, somebody else was brought in as the top White House reporter.
A white man.
a white man, and younger, no, older.
Older.
He was older, but he didn't know the White House, he didn't know the Washington scene. And State of the Union message time comes, and he can't get nobody, this top guy can't get anyone to give him the remarks ahead of time. Well, of course, Gerald had all these White House contacts, so finally, around 5 o'clock, he says, I'll just take one for the team. But I mean, obviously he was pissed.
Yeah.
He went and got the stuff, and he turned it over to this new guy who was sort of at the top of the team. I mean, there are these incidents that show his struggle
Yep.
with things that clearly were not fair. Of course, all of us struggle with things that aren't fair, but I mean, it's a really enlightening.
Sure. And I mean, given the times, the politics of the times, you wonder, is it race or is it just the crazy Byzantine politics of the New York Times and who's up and who's down, and people have their rabbis. That's what he said. You need a rabbi, and it shouldn't be me. Go find yourself somebody high up, and that's what people learn when they walk in there. Go find yourself somebody high up on the masthead who you can connect with and who can help guide you through the craziness at the time. So there's that too. But when those kinds of situations occur, I mean, he and even Bernie Weinrob, who was his partner covering the White House, the chapters open with anecdotes from people who knew Gerald, family or colleagues.
Did you solicit those?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's very, very interesting.
Yes, and Bernie writes one, and he writes about while they were covering the White House and they couldn't get the right seats on the plane, Bernie Weinrob would say, those blankety-blank bigots at the White House, they're giving us a hard time. And he said Gerald would just look at him like he was crazy. And Bernie would say, well, aren't you the one who's supposed to be frustrated by this? But Gerald, I think he recognized that his value and that he was good. He knew that he knew he was good. And so at some point, he stopped letting those slights get to him and get in the way. But they still nagged at him from time to time. Any other questions?
How did he feel about the times that you described, which is pretty much the times that I know of, but I never had any doubt that, and I was there when Rosenthal took over, I never had any doubt that the management system was to set everybody against everybody else. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't driven by anything other than the management culture of the paper. And how did Jerry feel when he moved to the other side of the wall? Because, at least in my view of the times, the plotting was really done on the management side of I was in the old building room in 43rd Street. The management side was up there playing the other side, everybody else, off against each other. And so what did it feel like to him to move from one side of that wall to the other?
I don't know that he saw it as the management.
What you call the
play.
management trap,
right? Well, yeah, the blue wall, right? I don't know because they all the offices and cubicles were along the blue wall. I don't know that he really saw it. That the management was playing people off of each other. He does write that it was slightly dysfunctional. He certainly understood that, and I think he tried.
Slightly?
I think he tried to be an anchor for people. I think women in the newsroom. I think they would argue that he was a feminist. He really tried to be a touchstone for people in the newsroom. Whatever, there were white guys who said he mentored me too. Someone who was a sane, a sanity in this sea of chaos. That's how he tried to present himself and to be for people. So I don't know that he saw he was moving to the enemy. I think he saw that he was going to do good.
It wasn't just the Times. I mean, what was Ben Bradley's famous phrase? Creative conflict or
Tension.
something. Creative tension.
Yes.
I mean, that was the modus operandi of most of these old newsrooms. Pit people against each other.
Yeah.
Just like dog fights or something.
Well, it worked wonderfully for the Times. I mean, at least from management's viewpoint, because they were scouring the country, getting the best people there were, and then throwing them into this dogfight.
Well,
And
it's
often doing
extremely
things that were
competitive.
irrational. Who was the old white man we're talking about? Who became White House correspondent?
Oh, Steve Roberts,
Yes, yes.
who took the job that most people.
But again, that's, you know, it's also the politics, you know.
I'll tell a Steve Roberts story about how the Times was. Steve was and Cokie Roberts is his wife. They were in Athens. He was the Athens bureau chief. And Abe Rosenthal wanted them to go to Bangkok, which, like Athens, was considered a second-level assignment as opposed to Paris, Moscow, London, the first Berlin. Cokie got them. They were really mad. And they turned down Bangkok. Said, you know, that won't work for us. The next thing they heard from the Times was Nick Gage's wife knocking on the door in Athens to come measure the curtains. And he was set back to the worst job on the paper, which was the New York correspondent in Washington. At that time, they had someone who covered city affairs in New York from the Washington angle. Mickey Carroll had that job for a long time, but of course the Washington Bureau wouldn't talk to him, and he was just there by himself reporting to New York. So it was always a really vicious place. I mean, they weren't kidding around.
Oh, this reminds me of this passing world. Well, I think we should give Robin a hand and go out and sign some books.
Thank you.